Hello, or if you're Donald Trump, bye-bye. This is the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, the author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
I think we should do a coup.
I like that. That's a nice interior rhyme. It does seem like the in thing these days to do a coup.
Is it actually an interior rhyme? Is do a coup? Is that what that is technically? Do we
They
need to
don't
get a
let me
poet
teach
on here?
poetry. They don't let me
Okay.
teach.
If
No.
we screwed it up, poets, send us a note. We're just prose people. Okay, but if we're gonna do a coup, can we do it at LitHub? Just like say that we're running LitHub and we've never heard of Johnny Diamond or Emily Firetog or any of the great people that work there. They can send their stories to us.
That sounds great. I'll just hang on a second. I'm just going to call the landscaping company to arrange the press conference.
I'm sorry. That's already been done. We're going to have to find somewhere else to have our press conference.
Well, damn it. All right. I got this. It's LitHub, right? So we'll announce our coup in Reading, Pennsylvania. Huh? Get it? Huh?
It's pronounced Reading.
If I say it's Reading, Whitney, it's Reading. And if I say there was massive vote fraud in Pennsylvania, then there was. And of course, we should run LitHub. I'm preparing for a smooth transition to a second Ganeshananthan Terrell administration.
I see what you did there. I see where I am on the ticket. I should have known that was coming. This conversation is why we've decided to talk about the 2020 election and its aftermath with someone else. And fortunately, two amazing writers have volunteered. In the second half of the show, we'll be talking to Gerald Walker, whose excellent book of essays, How to Make a Slave, has been nominated for the National Book Award.
But first, we're going to talk to Jess Walter, a past finalist for the National Book Award and winner of the Edgar Allan Poe Award. Jess is the author of 7 novels, 1 book of short stories, and 1 nonfiction book. His work has been translated into 32 languages, and his fiction has been selected 3 times for Best American Short Stories, as well as the Pushcart Prize and Best American Non-Required Reading. His stories, essays, and journalism have appeared in Harper's, Esquire, Playboy, McSweeney's, Tin House, Plowshares, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and many others. His previous novel, Beautiful Ruins, was a #1 New York Times bestseller and spent more than a year on the bestseller list. He joined in our 6th episode to talk about Beautiful Ruins and the Trump administration, and we're excited to welcome him back with another bestseller, his newest novel, The Cold Millions. Welcome to the show, Jess.
Thanks, Sugi. I can't believe I was on the 6th episode. This is like a very special reunion show or something when Fonzie comes back from the war or something.
That was how we were thinking of it, for sure.
I'm so excited. And I love the podcast. I was just listening to the Halloween episode, and I can't watch Poltergeist either. I just can't watch any horror movies there. Even before the last 4 years, I haven't been able to.
Oh my goodness, the last 4 years. Yeah, their own horror show.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being such a supporter of the show. And of course, for joining us multiple times. It's a treat to have you back. And in December of 2017, we were just talking about this. Doesn't seem like it was that long ago, and yet it seems like eternity. And we asked you about the literary elements of the Trump administration. Astonishingly, we were like, there are literary elements. We've stuck to that for a few years. And you admitted that the Trump administration had certain narrative elements that were familiar from literature: betrayal, father-son rivalry. And you said, quote, "What it doesn't seem to have is that other hallmark of literature, thematic depth or intelligence." Are you sticking with that for the literary quality of the post-Trump era?
I kind of feel like Nate Silver having to go out and explain myself. I have no predictive powers, clearly, at all. But yeah, I think it's fascinating and it's really interesting to watch. But if I was reading this novel, I would want more depth. It's like King Lear. I'm really interested to see what the Trump children do now and how they divide up his broke ass empire, who's going to take what debt, who's going to serve various times in prison. And so yeah, I do think that there are literary elements, but when you surround yourself with sycophants and criminals and the like, it becomes a Leonard Elmore story, and so it lacks that interiority. I don't really need to know what Michael Cohen was thinking. I actually wrote a very short story from his point of view, and it was a really shallow pool to wade around in.
Well, you know that there's this march going on right now. We're recording on Saturday, the 14th. So there's the Million MAGA
Million more.
March.
I believe there's a million more on March.
Yeah,
is what
well, I think there's maybe a couple thousand. It seemed like not a terrible crowd, but definitely not a million people.
Yeah.
And if he wasn't proposing that, if he had just acknowledged that he lost the election, this would be a totally normal thing to have happen. Be like, okay, your supporters come and say, thanks, you did a good job. We still like you. We're moving on. But instead, because the president can't admit that he lost, it has this sinister quality to it.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what it's hard to imagine a character like this in repose, what happens to a Trumpian revolution. And again, to go to literature, I think of Jack Cade in Henry IV Part 2, when these things tend to burn out like a quick flame and what's left are the true believers. And for me, the most disappointing thing about the Trump years always was realizing that the asshole ceiling in America is as high as 40%. I knew that 20% of people I had no business, thinking of as similar to me, but to imagine that Trump could pull 71 million votes or however many it's going to turn out to be is so discouraging. And his coalition is built of rich people who don't want to pay taxes, and people for whom racism is acceptable, and then people voting all sorts of conservative issues. And I still think those people are going to fall away, and I still think the Million MAGA March is going to be a few thousand, and I think he's going to be a much more marginalized figure. But I also believe I said something about the rats scurrying away from the ship, and they are scurrying so slowly. They're going back to the Lido deck and playing shuffleboard, and his people really seem on board, and it's as distressing to me as it was in 2016, and as it was on election day, to see this many people, still buying the grift.
Well, that was the context, and it wasn't just we were talking about his voters, but more you're referencing the conversation from our podcast in December 2017, where you talked about this was right after Flynn had gotten indicted,
right.
And you were talking about sort of in the terms of mob bosses and how eventually when the guys start getting in trouble at the top, everyone flips, and then that's the end of it. But there's the structure for Trump seems to be still among the leadership in the Republican Party who don't want to say like, hey, you lost the election, even though it's clear that he did. You talked a lot about self-interest. You said as soon as it's in their self-interest to oppose this guy or walk away from him, they will. And it just seems like maybe we haven't reached that point yet. I noticed people are debating, why did Trump fire all these people in the Defense Department over the last week? 4 or 5 different people. I think it's because he still wants to show that he can hurt you if you oppose him. He's trying to continue to force people to think it's in their self-interest not to get in this guy's way. He won't have that power for very much longer.
No, but he will. I don't think you can separate his power from the power he has over those 71 million voters. And that's the reason the rats aren't scurrying, because they don't really fear, Mitch McConnell doesn't fear being fired by Donald Trump. He's rat isn't right. He's, he has the survival power of a cockroach. He will be there, as long as the building stands. But what they do fear are those voters and his power over them. And I do think that that's where he's going to be marginalized. But in the next 2 years, I still think you're going to have to go visit Trump, and if you're a Republican, and win him over and visit him on his gold toilet and get his blessing. And, and I think that further fractures the Republican Party. I think, we, as Democrats, as liberals, as progressives, we're so aware of our own fractures, of our own battles. And I think the right is that's a mercurial person to have as your party leader in exile. And I don't think it bodes well for them in the long run. How long the long run is, I don't know. And in the meantime, they're very fearful. And especially with the Georgia with the Senate coming down to 2 seats in Georgia, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, those 2 seats, if the Democrats win them, we have a split Senate, and suddenly the Democrats, Vice President Harris is the deciding vote. And so until the Georgia election, you probably won't see Republican senators and representatives backing away. But I do think in the long run, the GOP will pay for hitching their wagon to this, to Trump. I really think they will.
I mean, I hope so. I'm really counting that. I realized I was reading the other day that, when Trump is no longer president, he will be subject to the same Twitter rules as everyone else. Yeah. I can't wait. It's going to be so great. And I don't know, the fact that they're willing to spend lives, right? They're not back. One of the reasons I think that they're not backing off is because, as you said, with Georgia, and then while they're waiting, right, they're not passing COVID relief, the asshole ceiling, like that's definitely like a reality series and Broke Ass Empire series that are going to be picked up by Bravo in a second. I would. Yeah. It's like he's the rat captain or something, but yeah, I mean, there's so many connections between your book also in the way that things are going now. Like it was interesting to read and think about all of the ways that these cycles just repeat, and these questions are like, to what limits will our leaders go? How many of our lives will they spend? And like, we seem to be so expendable still, like they haven't learned, which is just so depressing.
Or they have, and again, I think so much of this is about the pace of change and these sort of waves and currents that come over. And it's one of the things that caused me to write The Cold Millions in the first place, was trying to figure out how to write about income inequality back in 2014, 15, 16, and do it in a way that didn't feel didactic, that didn't feel preachy, but that felt alive in some other way. And that kind of connected with this idea to write about this period in my hometown that I'd always been fascinated by, this kind of border between the old West, the frontier that we think of, and a more modern world. And so yeah, I do think these things come up again, and one of the most disappointing things for me was to see Trump as a figure of populism and class division, because again, we maybe don't pick those figures, but he's not the person I think of when I think of populism and class, and the fact that it was portrayed that way has been a huge disappointment. And one of the reasons I wanted to return to a time when class divisions fell along the sort of progressive patterns that I think of.
So I wonder if we could maybe start off talking about those parallels and connections by having you read to us a little bit from the book first.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm going to read a section. So the book is about these 2 brothers, Gig and Ry Dolan.
Wait a second. Do we want to comment on the fact that something just fell off the wall behind you? Or are we just going to let it
go? I suppose people can see it. Yeah, it's a recent remodel to my office, and I keep putting things up, and they keep falling down. So.
Okay, damn it. All right, fine. Now go ahead.
All right. So the Cold Millions is about these 2 itinerant brothers, 2 hobos, Gig and Ry Dolan, in 1909, America, specifically Spokane, Washington, my hometown, and they are like many of the people at that time, hopping trains and going from town to town to look for work in agriculture, mining, timber. And they've arrived in Spokane, Washington, which is where 7 main rail lines come together, a kind of tramp central station, they call it. And And to get a job at that time, you had to line up at what were called job agents or job sharks. And they would send you out to the work site for $1. You'd have to pay $1 for the right to work. And then often they would split that dollar with the foreman and then fire you and send another crew out to make another $1. And then once harvest was over, they didn't need these workers anymore. They would send the cops to rough them up and drive them out of town. And so Gig and Rye are sort of in the center of this, and specifically the industrial workers of the world, the nascent labor union that was organizing these workers and trying to get them to stand up for their rights. In Spokane, they were outlawed from speaking on the streets. And so in November of 1909, they had the free speech protests, one of the first nonviolent protests in American history, where they just stood on soapboxes and spoke. And this is in the midst of those protests. Let's see. At the south end of the block stood another line of men, 6 uniformed cops led by Big John Sullivan. All of them had some lesser version of the chief's facial hair, bush beards or marmot sideburns, and Rye wondered if they'd chosen the force by sheer whiskers alone. If the chief had looked unhappy the day before, today he looked like he might rip the arms off the first man to speak. This turned out to be Walsh, who took a National Biscuit crate from another man and set it on the street in front of the worst job shop, the notorious Red Line Agency. A buzz went through the crowd. Here it comes. Sullivan was walking before Walsh even started speaking. Brothers and sisters, the labor man stumbled on the box, nearly lost his balance until Frank Little caught him, patted his coat and pushed him back up, a ripple of laughter passing through the crowd. In that moment, Rye thought Gig might be right about this being like a show at the Comique Theater. The tramps would do their tramp thing, and the cops would do their cop thing, and everything could return to what it was. Gig with a good story to tell the next time at Jimmy Durkin's. On the box, Walsh removed his hat and spread out his arms like a preacher. We're here to stand against injustice, to cheers and boos, in peaceful exercise of our right to speak out against the brutal tyranny of the city government and its corrupt bargain with these job agencies. Walsh was not a small man, and the crate made him a foot taller, but he seemed like a toy when Chief Sullivan marched up, 2 thick cops on either side. Rye recognized one of the cops as the Bulgoon, Hub Clegg. Sullivan yanked Walsh off the box and grabbed him by the neck like a chicken he might shake dead. He threw him to the ground and slammed a boot through the biscuit crate, Clegg wrestling Walsh's arms behind his back. Disperse, the chief yelled to the crowd. Next man steps on a box gets it worse, and worse for each after. No one moved, neither Wobblies nor crowd, and the chief turned and said something to Clegg. Then a voice in the crowd called out, hold the line, and that brought a cheer and more boos, a man calling, kill the bums, more cheers and chatter, the crowd speaking all at once, drowning out Sullivan. Then the people in front of Rye snapped their attention to the left as if a baseball had been lined up the middle, and Rye stood on tiptoes to see over the hats. Another box had appeared in the street, half a block north, and Frank Little was climbing on. This was the union's plan after Walsh was arrested, to go up one after the other in different spots, force the cops to scramble one end of downtown to the other, arrest dozens of them, and fill the jail with the only weapons they had, their bodies. Brothers and sisters, Little began, but before he could say another word, a cop was on him and threw him to the street. He disappeared in the crowd like someone slipping beneath waves. Disperse, Sullivan yelled again, and the crowd took a few steps back but didn't leave, Wobblies pressing forward, onlookers straining to see, every window on Stephen Street now full of people sticking their heads out, and a man yelling from a second-story window of a lawyer's office, this is freedom? You call this freedom? A few minutes later, the same man appeared in the doorway of the building, face bloodied, pushed into the street by one of the security men, his glasses skittering onto the cobblestone as he cried, what is my crime? What is my crime? The crowd rumbled and muttered like it hadn't chosen which team to root for, heads swinging left and right at signs of action. To the south, a young woman in a plain gray smock yelled, wake up, and a cop pulled her down the street. Then the crowd swung the other way to the north end of Stevens, where Frank Little had gone limp and was being dragged by the arms, his legs bumping on streetcar tracks. His soapbox was still in the street, and a long bearded man climbed up and began singing with a heavy Slav accent, "Oh, say, can you hear?" the first lines of the working man's Star-Spangled Banner, "coming near and more near." That man went down too, pounded by a security goon. But another man was already on the box behind him, and Rye yelled, "Jules," as if he might warn his friend, who either didn't know the workers' anthem or didn't like it, because he started singing in French, "C'est la lutte finale, groupons-nous et demain," and a cop standing just a few feet away cocked his head in confusion. But Hub Clegg had no hesitation and stepped in behind Jules with a raised nightstick, Rye reflexively closing his eyes rather than see the blow land. But when someone near him yelled, "Oh," Ryan opened his eyes and tried to fight through the crowd. That was when another voice, Chief Sullivan's, thundered, "Boys!" And a great surge came, and this was no longer a show or a baseball game, but a full-on riot. Cops and bullgoons mowing down Stevens, swinging nightsticks to clear the street, and people running, falling, being trampled. Rye swept up in a wave, moving north, his last view of Jules, a bloodied face, and his hands shackled behind his back.
Thank you. That's a really amazing and very well written scene. It's hard to write big action, like group scenes like that. I love the way that you talk about the way the attention of the crowd moves, like a baseball had been lined up the middle of the street. I thought that was nice.
Thanks.
The line in that passage that stood out for me, other than those craft issues that I'm talking about, is that moment when the man is demanding, "What is my crime?" You know, and I was thinking about, even though I know these riots are separated by many years, from the protests over George Floyd's deaths in cities across the country this summer, including Portland, which isn't so far from Spokane, is like on the map of your book, you know? But I couldn't help think of the unmarked vans filled with these sort of nameless government soldiers who didn't have, you know, a tag on there, sort of patrolling Portland this summer and arresting people without telling them why they were being arrested.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I started writing the novel, I was not, you know, thinking specifically, of course, about the Black Lives Matter protests, which are, you know, a thing of themselves. They are, you know, racism in this country and violence against people of color is, you know, is an issue that transcends, I think, anything. But certainly I was thinking about unrest. I was thinking about civil disobedience. I was thinking about protests. I spent much of the last 4 years protesting for women's rights, for science. You know, and in Spokane, my kids and I went to 3 Black Lives Matter protests, and so it very much felt like this, like it was in the air, you know, and to watch the way in which, the violence against protesters has been kind of normalized, and to watch, you know, a man pushed down by Buffalo police and then the police applauding, you know, one thing after another. It really felt like I was seeing the echoes of that kind of reaction to people protesting, you know, for basic rights, for, you know, for the kind of thing that I think we agree fundamentally should be beyond debate in this country. I chose these really young protagonists. Rye Dolan is 17, Gig is 23, and the hero of the novel is a real character named Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was 19 and pregnant and was leading the free speech movement in Spokane. And I chose them because over the last 4 years, I've been so inspired by watching youthful activism. Whether it's the shooting survivors from Parkland High School demanding, you know, basic gun laws, or students walking out of their schools for a response to climate change, and then being inspired by the young organizers of the Black Lives Matter protests. When people take to the streets, there's something really going on, and I can't say that I knew the summer was going to erupt in protests, but it certainly felt familiar as I was putting the finishing touches on the book.
Jess, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you both. Thanks for having me.
Listeners, don't miss Jess's fantastic new novel, The Cold Millions.